Blankenship Publishing presents Moon Dance, Book 1 of the Bloodbound series, by Amy Blankenship and R.K. Melton. Read for you by K.B. Stanford. Chapter 1. Angeles National Forest is home to the dangerous cougars and imported jaguars that roam the vast forest. Sometimes, on clear nights, their numbers grow for a little while as the L.A. were-animals, or shifters as folklore has come to know them, roam the untamed land among their distant cousins. It's those nights that the real animals hunker down in their dens, while the predators from the city invade their territory long enough to hunt, or, on rare occasion, settle fights that can't be settled on human turf. There's nothing more vicious than when those shifters fight and, if one of them are injured, they become just as dangerous to humans as their animal counterparts. To protect the humans they live among, shifter disputes, when possible, are always done out of the range of those humans, and the best place is deep within their native hunting grounds. Tonight the forest became hauntingly quiet as the two owners of the biggest club within the city entered the untamed land, stripping the clothes from their backs to let their inner beast run free. Tonight they were hunting for the grave of a vampire that could destroy them both. Deep within the forest where no humans could hear them, Malachi, the leader of a small jaguar clan, sprinted through the darkness toward his adversary, a man he should have never trusted over his best friend. His target was another shifter, this one with the blood of the cougar running through his veins, Nathaniel Wilder, his business partner for the last 30 years. Malachi broke into the clearing to find Nathaniel standing there, waiting on him in human form. Taking a couple steps forward, it was like walking from one form into another as Malachi reverted back to his human shape. Both of them were lethal no matter which form they shifted into. As humans, they were both athletic with steely muscles tensed under soft skin. Shifters were slow to age, and both men barely looked past 30, even though they were well into their 50s. Had this been a Hollywood movie, it would have taken several minutes to be grossly changed, but this was reality, and there were no drooling monsters in this clearing. Nudity was nothing to a shifter, and the moon beamed down like a spotlight through a break in the storm clouds above them. "It doesn't have to come to this," Nathaniel said as he held his ground while trying to talk reason into his friend. "Listen to me! It was 30 years ago, and things have changed. I have changed." 30 years' worth of lies! Malachi thundered, his voice echoing in the clearing. His gaze trailed to the spot he'd buried Cain, and he felt the sting of moisture gather in his eyes. "Because of you, I bound Cain to the dirt. Because of you, I have forsaken him for 30 years. I can't let you dig him up, Malachi. You know what will happen if you do." Nathaniel watched nervously as Malachi gazed longingly upon the grave of the man that had once been his best friend. He'd never understood it. Cain was a vampire, and dangerous. Cain had also been one of the two things standing in the way of the partnership forming between the jaguars and the cougars. Cain and Malachi's beautiful, deceitful, cheating wife, Carlotta. Nathaniel had loved her first. He hadn't meant for it to turn out this way. In the end, Nathaniel had taken care of the problem in a jealous rage, killing 2 birds in one foul swoop. "He was my best friend and never betrayed me. You were the one who stabbed me in the back." Malachi blinked back the tears of fury as he reached up and touched the earring he was wearing. Cain's earring. What had he done? When he'd found Cain bent over his dead wife, he'd paused in confusion until Nathaniel had confirmed Cain as the murderer. She'd died right here in this field, so he'd thought it only right to bind Cain to this land, in this soil. He'd even stolen Cain's spellbook and used it against him for revenge. Yeah, Nathaniel was right about one thing. Most vampires were evil, but there were a few exceptions, and Cain had been one of them. But nothing was more evil than what he himself had done. This spell could only be reversed by Cain's soulmate. Malachi had thought it funny at the time because Cain had been ageless and yet had never met his soulmate. In the past, he and Cain had often joked that such a woman would never be born. His mind flashed back to Cain's smile as he'd said, "God would have to have a sense of humor to ever create a woman that would put up with some of his antics." "He's been under there too long," Nathaniel warned. "With that kind of bloodlust and insanity riding him, if you free Cain now, he will only kill us." Malachi's head snapped up, and he glared at Nathaniel. "He will only have to kill me, because you will already be dead." With the threat issued, both men shifted once again into their animal forms. On the edge of the campground nearest the massive game preserve, Tabitha King, or Tabby as everyone seemed to call her, sat on the steps of her parents' huge camper looking up at the stars peeking out of the thick clouds. She blew her bangs out of her eyes, glad it had finally stopped raining. This was the first time she'd ever been camping, and the last thing she wanted to do was be cramped up inside the RV. She'd been so excited about this trip, and was even happier when they'd agreed to bring the small family dog, Scrappy. It had taken a lot of begging, but after promising to take care of her little best friend, a Yorkie puppy, she'd finally won her reluctant parents over. Scrappy was currently barking out at the darkness, wiggling around on his leash, wanting to chase the shadows that had gotten his attention. The little girl gasped when Scrappy suddenly pulled free of his leash and ran off. She stood up on the steel steps when the puppy darted through a small opening in the bottom of the fence that separated the campground from the game reserve. "Scrappy, no!" Tabby cried out and ran after the dog. Her parents had trusted her not to lose him. Stopping at the fence, she inhaled while staring out at the darkness of the trees. "I'm not a coward." She bit her bottom lip in determination before dropping to her knees to investigate the opening. After a couple of small scrapes, she'd squeezed through the same hole in the fence and was running through the woods, following the sound of distant yapping. "You're gonna get me in trouble," she whispered harshly, then started clicking her tongue, knowing the puppy often came to the sound. "Tabby, where are you?" Behind her, Tabitha heard her mother calling, but she was more interested in getting her dog back to the campsite. Scrappy was her dog, and she had to take care of him. So instead of calling back to her mom or to the puppy, she stayed quiet and followed the sound of Scrappy's high-pitched barking. It wasn't long before Tabitha had to stop for a minute and catch her breath. She leaned back against a tree and put her hands on her dirty knees, breathing and listening to the sounds of the forest. She'd always wanted to stand in the middle of the woods and just listen like the Indians did on the TV movies. The rain clouds that had parted for a little while came back, and the bright moonlight suddenly disappeared. Her eyes widened when she realized she couldn't see the lights from the campground anymore. Taking a tentative step forward, she looked around wildly, but all she saw was darkness, barely discernible tree trunks, and even darker shadows. She whimpered when something growled off in the distance behind her. Deciding she didn't like that direction, she took off running without looking back. After what seemed like forever, she heard Scrappy barking again and darted in that direction, hoping whatever had growled wasn't chasing her. She heard another growl, but this time it was coming from somewhere in front of her. Digging her heels into the ground, she tried to slide to a stop, but the soil was covered with sleek leaves and muck from the rain. Instead of stopping, she slid even further onto her side before dropping down a gradual slope. The breath was knocked out of her when her body hit a fallen tree, stopping her slide. The first thing she noticed after catching her breath was that Scrappy wasn't barking anymore. She heard the growl again and started to climb back up the hill when she heard a soft whimper. Pushing up on her knees, she peeked over the tree trunk and saw a small clearing where the moonlight was shining straight down. Right there in the center was Scrappy, whining like he'd just been beat up by the dog down the street at home. The puppy was flat on the ground and crawling backwards. Her blue eyes widened when she saw why. Two animals were slowly moving toward each other in the clearing, and Scrappy was right in the middle. "Dummy!" Tabby hissed under her breath. She recognized the animals from pictures her dad had shown her before they went on the trip. One was a cougar, and the other she recognized from television. A jaguar. She loved to watch animal shows and wasn't squeamish like her mommy when the animals on TV tried to attack each other. But this was different. It was real, and a little frightening. They were cats that could eat you, big ones too. The graceful animals circled each other, growling deep in their throats, and their eyes glimmered like golden medallions. The deadly sound carried on the breeze, blowing toward Tabitha as she continued to watch them with nervous awe. "Come on, Scrappy," she whispered, hoping the huge cats didn't hear her. "Get over here before one of them steps on you." She was going to say, "eats you," but she didn't want to scare the poor puppy any more than it already was. The cats suddenly screamed, making Tabitha cover her ears with her palms because it was so loud and scary sounding. They ran at top speed across the clearing, making Scrappy tuck his tail between his legs and squeal out of fear. Seeing the traumatized puppy, Tabitha scrambled over the tree and ran toward Scrappy as fast as she could. She was closer to Scrappy than the cats were and dove down, quickly covering his small body with hers just as the two animals leapt up and collided in the air directly above her. "Please don't hurt my dog!" she screamed. She screamed again when sharp claws raked her arm and another grazed down her back. The cats hit the ground directly behind her with a bone-jarring thud, growling and screaming at one another. She remained hunched over Scrappy, who was still shaking and whimpering softly, not daring to look at the animals fighting only a few feet behind her. Tabitha was afraid to move and held on to the dog as tightly as she could. Her eyes were clenched, and she started whispering to Scrappy to run and get help if one of the cats got her too. Something wet and warm sprayed across her back, but she still didn't move. Finally, the fighting stopped, and she chanced to look over her shoulder. She started shaking and crying when she saw two men lying behind her with blood all over them. Tabitha slowly rose to her knees with Scrappy in her arms and started to back away. Where had the cougar and jaguar gone? Did they attack these two men, then run away? Why didn't the men have any clothes on? Nathaniel suddenly opened his eyes and bared very sharp teeth at her. Tabitha stumbled backwards and nearly fell, but regained her footing. Scrappy squealed again when the man's growl mimicked that of the cougar and fought his way out of Tabby's arms. He ran away into the forest, yelping out of fear. Malachi twitched as blood gushed from his chest. He opened his mouth and growled one word toward the little girl. "Run!" His voice ended with the ear-piercing scream of a jaguar. Tabitha didn't think twice about obeying. She turned on her heels and ran from the clearing without daring to look back. She didn't care where she was going, only that she got away from the scary men, covered in blood. Thank you, and this is the local news. Tonight, a local family has reason to celebrate. Their daughter, Tabitha, was finally found wandering aimlessly within Angeles National Forest after going missing 3 days ago from a campsite near Crystal Lake to find the family dog. Apparently, the dog had freed itself from its leash and run into the forest. The 7-year-old courageously chased after the dog and wasn't found until this morning. Unfortunately, the dog wasn't found with her. According to officials, she is at the community hospital recovering from shock, as it appears she has survived a cougar attack. Little Tabitha kept telling the forest rangers about 2 injured men in the forest, but after a thorough search of the area of 5,000 square miles, nothing has been found. We'll fill you in more later in the hour.